So we're moving now into the area of strategic choices for businesses, chapter 12. Let's take a look at the first section. This pertains to marketing. And we should know that marketing, broadly speaking, is about customer needs and indeed satisfying customer needs. Let's look at variables. We know that some businesses make, manufacture, and supply products. Some businesses offer services. Now, in terms of products v services, in terms of marketing, we should understand that we have, the 7 main areas. Taking products first, if we think about a given product, then there's 4 main areas of marketing that a company needs to think about. They need to think about the product itself, for example, features. They need to think about how they price it, for example, in relation to competitors. They need to think about how they promote it, in what sense, in what way, television, online, social media, etc. And then finally, they need to think about place. In other words, where do consumers and customers get access to that product? Is it through a retail shop? Is it online, etc.? In terms of services, slightly different. It's very, very difficult to sort of separate a service, for example, from the people that supply that service. So, in essence, people first. And indeed, outside of that, generally, when you have a service, you're going to have a series of processes. For example, in relation to a restaurant, an ordering process. Next key point and third one in relation to the P's is physical evidence. So using the example that I just gave in terms of a restaurant, certainly the atmosphere in a restaurant is physical evidence. The sort of ambience is physical evidence. So in essence, when we think about products versus services in the area of marketing, we're really talking about the 7 main P's, with the first 4 relating to products and indeed the next 3 as an add-on for services. So we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail now. The area of the product itself. So when we think about a given company producing a product, that in terms of marketing, these are really the key areas. They have choices to make in terms of whether or not their product is aimed at the high quality area, choices about packaging and indeed branding and general aesthetics. Perhaps there is a mix of products that they make. How do they mix them? What are the elements? And then over and above that, in relation to this particular product that they make or manufacture, what is relevant in terms of the servicing or, a warranty, or do they provide a guarantee? So in terms of marketing, these are the key areas that an individual company will need to assess and understand in relation to their product. Next key area for us is price. Now, this is obviously key to businesses, certainly when you have a product that is in demand, pricing it properly. Now, there's several options. These are just 2. The first one here, we see penetration pricing. So a given firm could choose a penetration pricing policy. And what that means is basically a low price. So it may well be that this is a new product on the market and the firm decides in terms of their choice on pricing stroke marketing, price low to achieve early market share advantages. People like low prices. That you will gain market share by simply pricing low and indeed then move on from that tactic or policy going forward. So again, that's just one option. What about skimming? The idea of high prices early on. Perhaps it's a new, very desirable, differentiated product. It's just being introduced onto the market. If we keep prices high, we're going to reap maximum profits or maximum margins very early. And again, we can change our tactics or approach going forward. So these are just 2 options. Outside of that, when we think about price, there's a number of things that will influence a company or a firm's decision making in relation to price. These are just a few. For example, economic. Let's say that there's a recession, then maybe we need to price low. What are competitors doing? How do they do it? And we need to perhaps match them or indeed beat them. Outside of that, for example, it may well be that at this particular time of the year, discounts are a good idea. Let's discount the price. Linked into that, things like payment terms. How do customers pay? Do we allow them credit? Is there a penalty for not paying on time? Etc., etc. Last point here is life cycle. Now, note up top when we considered penetration pricing and indeed price skimming. Really, where we are in terms of the life cycle of the product is important. And we should understand in relation to PLC or product life cycle, really, products can be introduced. They can have an introduction phase. They can have a growth phase. After that, they could have some sort of maturity phase. The products have been around for a period of time and things are settling. Let's say the market isn't growing particularly rapidly. And then after that, fourth phase, generally decline. So pricing may well be tactical in the sense that we may change our policy from time to time. For example, between introduction and indeed growth, or between growth and indeed maturity. So in terms of the area of pricing and marketing, there are a number of different factors that will influence a firm's decision on how to price and at what level to price at. So we're on now to our third area. Bear with me one second. Promotion. Now remember that these first 4 P's really are relevant to all products and services, but generally the first 4 associated with products only. So in terms of promotion, firms have a consideration as to how to promote, how to advertise, a number of different possibilities with different costs attached to each one. Outside of that, it may well be at different times of the year that some sort of sales promotion takes place. As I said up top, perhaps at Christmas time, maybe we'll be looking at discounts. Linked into that is the whole area of public relations and indeed getting information out to the public. For example, a press release for a new launch. Linked into promotion, perhaps we have a sales team. Perhaps we sell directly to the public. How are these sales teams trained, as an example? So that's promotion. Next area for us is place. In other words, where. Where and how do consumers and customers get access to this particular product? What decisions do we make in relation to that? So the first area really to consider is logistics. The idea that really we need to look to divide the market, broadly speaking, into groups. Yeah? And indeed, those groups may act in a different way. So understanding how they act and what their needs are is certainly relevant in terms of our logistics, how we get the product to them, how they will react if the product is in such and such a place. In relation to the channels side, what are channels? Really when we think about channels, we're talking about speed. We're talking about the idea of how quickly we can get a product to a particular customer. Several approaches here are possible. The first one, when we think about a product, is really product push. The idea that we push the product out, regardless of the consumer, out to distributors. And we say, here you are, stock these products, customers will come in due course. Flip side of that really is customer. The idea that, we do activities to persuade the customer to demand the product from retailers and indeed distributors, in effect pulling the product through the chain. So they're both sort of equal and opposite in one sense. Next area for us is people. So here we're sort of moving in, aren't we, to the area of the provision of the service. First four we looked at, broadly speaking, sort of product related. But when we think about a service, let's think about it. I use the example of a restaurant. People are important. You know, their appearance, their dress, their attitude, their behavior, their professionalism. These are important areas and all part of this marketing mix. We need to have, for example, well-trained waiters, a well-trained maitre d'. Outside of that, other sort of skills areas important. Now, how knowledgeable are they of the menu of the food? How committed are they? And how much discretion do they have? So this area of people really pertains to not just what we see of the people, for example, a waiter in a restaurant, but also their attitude and indeed some soft skills as well. Linked into that next area on services is really the processes. In other words, the processes associated with that particular service. You know, and that could be anything from a sort of a policy or possibly some sort of automation or mechanization. It could be something to do with, let's say, a booking or a booking service, perhaps online via a website. And indeed, outside of that, perhaps the ease, you know, is there queuing? You know, does the process, whatever it is, does it take a long time? Is the process glitchy in some way in a software sense? So again, these are areas, the various processes that make up the provision of this service are key to its success. Last area, physical evidence. Again, using the restaurant example, you know, the environment, the atmosphere, the general vibe of the restaurant may well be absolutely crucial. You know, for example, layout, the noise, ambience, etc. Outside of that, when we think of things like airlines, certainly the facilities available. And indeed, outside of that, perhaps the uniforms or clothing worn by staff. In addition to that, when we think of physical evidence, we're talking about things really that consumers and customers can see. They're very, very evident immediately. You know, things like labeling or logos or indeed packaging. These are key to a marketing sort of element or indeed the success of marketing for a business. Okay? Now, next key area for us is, you know, I guess linked into marketing. As mentioned, marketing is about satisfying customer needs. And indeed, linked into that, as I've just said, is, you know, competitive advantage is key. If your marketing is different, it's highly likely you'll be more successful. In other words, you'll have more of a competitive edge. Now, when we think about competitive edge, in terms of the choices that a given company has, they've got a range of choices in this area. For example, when we think about price-based strategies, you know, a company, as we said up top when we talked about the first 4 Ps, a company has several options in terms of pricing. You know, for example, we could start a price war. We could base our strategy, our overall strategy, on really beating the competition in terms of price or reduced prices. Linked into that is one of Porter's generic strategies, often referred to as cost leadership. Now, what we mean by that is that really a firm focuses on being the lowest cost producer. Now, note that this is slightly different to a price war. A price war pertains to your retail price, in other words, the price that you sell to consumers. A cost leadership approach means you're really focusing on being the lowest cost producer. So really we're talking about economies of scale. I'm talking about making volumes and volumes and volumes of units and indeed outperforming or gaining competitive advantage by being able to produce units at a much, much lower cost than competitors. Outside of that, you know, we could focus on particular segments and indeed price accordingly to our knowledge of the segment. In other words, the individuals in that segment and indeed their behavior. So these are price-based strategies geared towards a competitive advantage, which essentially is an edge. Now remember that we want to sustain competitive advantage. In other words, we want to keep it. How else could we do that? Well, what about differentiation rather than price? What about focusing on being different? Now, in this particular area, clearly things like products with better features or improved features are going to allow us to gain that competitive edge. If we have a product and we add better features, we are differentiating. We are making ourselves different to other competitors. People will warm to that. Last one here is lock-in. So we've talked about, pursuing price-based strategies, a price war, a low-cost producer, etc. We talked about differentiating. Let's make ourselves different. If we're different, then people are going to buy our high-quality product. What about lock-in? What does that mean? Well, lock-in sort of does what it says in the tin. It basically suggests that you can gain competitive edge by trying to lock consumers into your product. In other words, provide them with a sort of a no-brainer in one sense. Now, how might you do that? Well, for example, if you were first mover in the market, in other words, if this market had opened up and you had one of the first products available in that section, then in essence, you could try, perhaps on a contractual basis, to lock people in, to lock consumers in. They're excited about this particular product. You are a first mover. You're the first firm or organization on the pitch supplying this product. Lock people in because you are a first mover. Outside of that, in terms of lock-in, certainly lock-in can happen at the outset, let's say with the launch of a new product and you're a first mover, but you need to enforce it over time. You need to keep changing and keep up to speed. Next area for us in terms of this opening up of marketing and sustaining competitive advantage is looking in more depth about price. Okay. Now, excuse me. In terms of possibilities in this area, certainly we can maintain a price-based approach with low margins if we're able to increase volume over time. So think about economies of scale, but in terms of pricing. So, the idea of low margins isn't bad if we're constantly able to increase the volume that we sell. Next one we've touched on top, price wars. Now, price wars are dangerous. Price wars can be dangerous. Price wars can put and have put businesses out of business. This is a risky strategy, but it can work. Cost leadership, I've just mentioned up top, is about lowest cost producer, the idea of spreading your fixed costs over volumes. And the last area, as mentioned, is the idea of targeting a particular segment. Let's understand that particular segment and let's price accordingly. Next area for us, differentiation. As we've said, this is about really uniqueness. This is about really the quality of your product and indeed the consumer's perception of your brand. Think about a high-end supermarket that has premium products, high quality, etc. Branding is absolutely key. A good example perhaps in the UK might be Marks and Spencer's. In terms of linking into the whole idea of differentiation, if we want to differentiate, we have to have a product with features that appeal to consumer, special features, unique features, premium features. If we do, then consumers will pay a higher price. Invariably, differentiation is associated with high prices and indeed high margins. One other way to do this, rather than just simply focusing on our product and its quality and what we do and differentiating it, is we could look at other areas within the value chain. In other words, bear with me, we could look at our suppliers, we could look at our distributors. So we can differentiate in a number of ways. It doesn't purely have to be based on the quality of the individual product. Niching. When we think about Porter's generic strategies, broadly speaking, if we simplify it, we're really talking about either sort of cost leadership, differentiation as mentioned up top, or last area for us really is niching. In other words, niche or indeed focus. And again, this really pertains to segments or segments of the broader market. So perhaps that we have a specialized product that sort of addresses the needs of that segment. Let's niche straight into it. Perhaps I recall years and years ago where you had a company in the UK called Tyrac, okay? And they only supplied high quality, high end ties, very, very expensive ties. But really what they were doing is not so much catering to the entire men's clothing market. They found a segment, a niche, and indeed they priced their products, their ties, accordingly, very, very high. That's a good example of niching or indeed focus. Now, last one, it was the lock-in strategies that we spoke about up top. Now, lock-in is quite straightforward, and a very, very good example perhaps is Microsoft. The idea that, once you buy a PC, it may well be preloaded with the Microsoft suite. So we're really talking about, leading in a particular area of the market because your particular product is industry standard. And indeed, when you buy a PC, it's preloaded, you are locked in. Now, you need to be careful with lock-in strategies. There are a number of factors that could affect your success. You need to ensure that customers believe in that product. There needs to be a perception of dominance, and there certainly would be with a company like Microsoft, absolutely. Next area that might affect success is this area that we touched on up top of first mover. Certainly, if you're a first mover in a market, then certainly that adds value. That gives the idea of dominance. If there are perhaps no other players or only one or two other players, that could affect your success. Next area for us is bundling. Again, linking with the example of Microsoft. If you have the ability to bundle a series of elements to this sort of product line, your success may come more easily. Last area for us is regulation. In terms of locking people in some way, shape or form to a product or a series of bundled products, we need to be careful about what the regulatory environment does or says. For example, there may be concern over competition or anti-competition. So legislation, etc., is certainly relevant, could stop us having success in terms of a lock-in strategy. Now, this area of the strategy clock is important. Now, so far what we've said is that a business has a series of choices to make in relation to, for example, marketing, for example, pricing, etc., etc. Now, what Bowman's strategic clock says is that really there are two very, very important areas when you're looking at strategic choice. The first one is price and indeed how you price. We've touched on that. But the second one is perhaps a little bit more important. It's customers' sort of perception of value, the idea of perceived value added. And what Bowman's clock effectively says is these are the two key variables in terms of the choices you make. So what do we actually mean by perceived value? Really, it's about perception of value. In other words, if we're looking at a given product, we're really saying, how do the customers perceive this product? And indeed, in terms of techniques that we could employ in a marketing sense, how does that change their perception of value? Now, we'll look at the model in a second, but in essence, so what we're saying here is that the two key things in terms of this strategic clock are left-hand side value, and note that we go between low perceived value and indeed high perceived value. And then down the bottom, we're talking about price. Again, left-hand side low and indeed right-hand side high. So in essence, what Bowman says is you've got a number of options in terms of your approach, okay? So let's look at the obvious ones. When we think about number one here, we're thinking about low price and low added value. Now, many companies operate in this sort of area, but probably with low-end, undifferentiated products. If we're sort of moving up the area of perceived value here we're talking about low price, but with the perceived value increasing slightly, all the way up towards a high perceived value. Now, notice that if we move around the clock to the right-hand side here, this is the area really where there are, high margins or indeed high profits. Why is that? It's because when we consider the customer and indeed how they think and their needs, their perceived value, their perception of the value of the product is very, very high. And indeed, outside of that, because we're considering the area of differentiation, unique features, premium, high quality, etc., there's options here for the price being high. So here, really, this is where the highest margins are. I guess here is where the lowest margins are, and you need very, very high volume. This area here, according to the strategic clock, is really areas that need to be avoided. Why is that? Well, because in one sense, what we're talking about is, high pricing, but unfortunately, the perceived added value in terms of the customer and how they think is very, very low. And as the clock suggests is, if you're in this area, 7, for example, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to have success because your pricing is too high, and broadly speaking, consumers or customers don't really have a great perception of the value of your product. Okay, let's move on to the next area here, and this is Ansoff. So this eminent theorist, Igor Ansoff, and his his matrix, and this is essentially really a quadrant in one sense. I'll explain what that means in a moment, but in terms of what we mean by a quadrant, I think the first thing to clarify in relation to what Igor Ansoff, this Harvard professor, suggests is that if we think about products, we could use services, but let's just take it that we're focusing on a product, and indeed that product exists in a market, then the suggestion here in terms of these two dimensions is that, broadly speaking, in terms of future action, future strategic choices, future tactics to expand, what Igor Ansoff is suggesting is that a business that perhaps produces a product has 4 main choices. They could use the current products, or perhaps they could produce new products. In terms of the market, they could operate in a new market or just stay in the current market. So in essence, in terms of the dimensions, what Igor Ansoff is saying is to expand, to grow, to increase market share and increase revenue, increase profits. You've got 4 main options, and they're all based around the product and the market. Now, I'll take you through these areas in a moment, but in essence, what we're saying is that this matrix is an expansion grid. Igor Ansoff is suggesting 4 options for an individual firm or an individual company in terms of how they move themselves forward, how they expand. So in terms of the sort of detail here, a couple of things to consider first before we go into the various areas of the grid. The first one is just the concept of consolidation. Outside of what we've suggested in terms of expansion, what would consolidation mean? Does that mean sort of doing nothing? Well, not exactly. It broadly means leaving aside the 4 main options that Igor Ansev suggests. If we were to decide, well, hold on a minute, let's just consolidate. Well, what that would involve is, protecting, strengthening, reshaping, innovate. It doesn't involve standing still. It doesn't involve doing nothing. It involves really the idea to assess where we are. So let's say we don't plan immediately to expand, for example, using product development or market development. Let's just take a view on where we are right now. So what would be, if we decided to simply consolidate, what would be the possible tactics for consolidation? Well, several. We could consider, based on what we see, we need to downsize. We need to close some factories. We need to close some retail stores. What else could we do? Well, what about if we withdraw? What about if this area of the business is underperforming, so we need to get out of it? That's a form of consolidating. Outside of that, let's consider ways in which we can simply just, rather than expand, just maintain our market share. How can we, given this competitive and or volatile environment, what do we need to do just to stand still? Perhaps we need to do more marketing. We need to do more just to be able to maintain and consolidate our position. So there's this sort of not so much stand still option, but an option that involves really taking stock and trying to maintain the position that we're now at. Let's move into the grid now. Now, as we saw up top, Anselm suggests that there are several areas, basically 4. The first one is penetration. Now remember, we're talking about a business trying to expand. The Anselm's matrix is a product expansion grid. So how would we penetrate, and what does market penetration mean? Well, broadly speaking, it means more of the same. It means to continue to do what we've been doing for the last year, for the last 5 years, for the last 20 years. It means to expand market share. Now, you remember from the grid that market penetration, if I just show you what's back up top, market penetration was the very first one, sort of broadly alongside consolidation, although I think we can take consolidation as being not so much do nothing or stand still, but just really taking stock. So in terms of market penetration, I think that's slightly different to consolidation. We're talking about the current product, i.e. the products that we have on the shelf right now in the current market. We're really saying we want to increase our market share based on what we've been doing for the last year, 5, 10, etc. Okay? Now, in terms of ways in which we could do that, how do we increase our market share based on our current products in our current market? Let's say we take the market as being our home country. Okay? Well, increase advertising. Let's do more advertising. Let's broaden our distribution channels so we can get our products out in different ways to different areas of the country. We could penetrate by cutting price. That will take share away from other competitors. If we're cheaper, there's a fair chance, if we're a well-established player in the market, that we can gain market share from competitors. Let's consider some introductory offers, some new offers. Perhaps there's an add-on, perhaps it's a discount. So several techniques for us to increase our market share and to penetrate the market further. Now note that what the grid, or indeed the matrix, is about, in one sense, outside of expansion and methods of expansion, it's also about risk, isn't it? And I would say, and I'm sure you'd agree, that the idea of doing more of the same, i.e. penetrating the market with current products in a current market, is the least risky. So this is the least risky option for a business to expand. To use these tactics, to use these choices to gain market share. What about market development? This is, I guess, the next area up in terms of risk. This is really, as we see from the grid, if I go back up again, this is the idea that we use current products in a new market. So as mentioned previously, if we accept or take the market to be perhaps the home country, perhaps we should expand into a neighboring country. That would be a new market, but we're going to do it with our current products. So if we go back down again, in terms of options, really, outside of a neighboring country, there's a couple of options. Obviously, neighboring country, we're really talking about geographic, as it were. It's a country that's next door. It's easy to get to, easy to find. Or maybe we might be talking about segments within a given market. Perhaps we've been selling to older people. Perhaps we can change things slightly and adjust into a new segment, perhaps middle-aged, etc. Along with that, possibly, although this would be a little bit more difficult, perhaps new uses for existing products. In effect, that's a new market. But generally speaking, under Ansof's banner, and certainly within SBL style questions, when we think about new markets, we're talking about geographic. Okay? Now, what are the main advantages of this particular approach? Market development? Well, there's several. If we're expanding into a new market, clearly economies of scale are going to be available. We're going to be selling more, so we're going to be spreading our fixed costs, ideally, over more units. In addition to that, risk is reduced. Certainly, if we're focusing only on the home market, we have risks associated with operating in that home market. If we're focusing on, let's say, a neighboring country with a different economy, et cetera, different consumers, then we're diversifying, aren't we? We're spreading our risk. In addition to that, in terms of competition, certainly, if we're expanding internationally, perhaps into a neighboring country, that is going to deter or certainly make competition, not just in our home country but elsewhere, uncomfortable. This is a company that's doing well. We're now expanding into different markets. It looks good. Disadvantages, several disadvantages, absolutely. When we think about disadvantages for development, the idea of moving into a different country is such that, we're in a completely new environment. We don't know these consumers. In these new segments, we don't know how these individual new consumers are going to react. Okay? Let's move into our next area now. And this is product development. Remember that we talked in terms of Ansof's matrix as it is a grid where risk increases as we move from area to area. So just reminding you of what's on the grid, least risky market penetration, current products, current markets. A little bit more risky using current products in a new market. We're going to expand, let's say, into a neighboring country. Now we're moving into product development. Now, what we mean by that clearly is a new product in the current market. So we're familiar with the market, but this product is new. Let's say it hasn't been tested. This creates certainly more risk. So let's look at this area here. Now, several things to consider when we think about product development. Certainly, customers with a new product want more information. If they're going to spend money, they want value for money. Okay? Now, outside of that, we need to ensure that if we're going to launch a new product, that we have analyzed the market carefully. Yeah, analysis skills, e.g., data mining, are absolutely key. We've got to do our research because if the product fails, we lose money. Outside of that, certainly other CSFs that we've experienced may well be relevant. In other words, things like, the information that we have in relation to consumer habits, things like big data, things like analytics, etc., etc. Now, in terms of product development, clearly we're talking about an investment in R&D and innovation and new quality, etc. There are some potential problems associated with product development. This product obviously is new. Now, albeit for the fact that we're launching it in a current market, let's say the home country, it may not succeed. It may not succeed. It may not be a success. It's untried. The flip side of that, in one sense, is, it may well be that product development is something that we have to do. It's a necessity. We need to develop new products. We need to launch new products. We've got no choice, for example, because competitors are doing it. So that creates a little bit of difficulty, backs against the wall. Next area for us is product diversification. Okay, so really what we're talking about is moving into something that is completely new to us. It's completely different. When we think about diversification as part of the grid, remember, this is the most risky area. We're talking about a new product in a new market. So it may well be that we develop what we feel is a very, very solid new product, but we're going to launch it in a neighboring country, in a completely new market. That is very much high risk. So advantages, well, certainly some economies of scale through synergies. It may well be that we have some competence in some related area, and as a result of that, we gain some form of economy of scale by producing large bundles or units over time. Outside of that, it may well be that perhaps diversification or product diversification is a good idea because we think we have an excellent management team. I believe the example in the study hub is Virgin, i.e. Virgin, firstly being obviously an airline, but then launching into a number of different diversified areas. So corporate managerial capabilities, in one sense, is just really using the expertise that we have in this area of diversification. Outside of that, certainly our market power would be increased through the cross synergy. Maybe the idea that we have a number of different talents, a number of different sort of abilities is going to give us an element of synergies, 1 + 1 = 3. So those would be the advantages, but there are some very, very important disadvantages associated with diversification, or indeed product diversification. The first thing is the amount of time and effort involved, and indeed cost. To diversify, broadly speaking, means to do something that's completely new or different. There may be some synergies, you may have some confidence, it may be related in some way, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of energy, time, and money that needs to be spent to undertake a diversification exercise. Outside of that, diversifying may be difficult for your employees, for your managers. If we have a diversification approach, different strategies are going to be required for different types of product and different types of energy. That may be difficult for managers, employees, and for the business to cope with. Let's move on from there. When we think about new products in markets, one thing that's important is to recognize that, a new product or indeed a new market really takes a company's attention, takes managers' attention, takes boards' attention away from what they are doing. Okay? Now, if we look at this diagram here, you'll see that there are various possibilities in terms of new products and new markets. We're talking about the area of diversification. So if we had, for example, a manufacturer here, okay, and they're looking to diversify in some way, then clearly they have a number of options. We talked earlier on about sort of integration, in particular vertical integration. So if we have a manufacturer here, we could perhaps diversify in some way in a sort of using horizontal integration. The idea that we're sort of moving towards either competitive products or indeed complementary products in some way. Okay? Now note that this is related diversification, doing something that relates to what we already do in some way, shape or form. So getting back to this manufacturer, what about if we consider going backwards? Okay? Now what does that mean? Well, possibly moving towards perhaps the transport area, or possibly, the supply of raw materials to us. Perhaps we could diversify into the production of those raw materials, or perhaps the production of a component that is essential. Linked into that, what about financing? Clearly manufacturing is capital intensive. It requires finance for equipment, for buildings, for factories, etc. Perhaps we could move into the area of financing in some way and possibly finance other manufacturers. So we've touched on horizontal, sort of going sideways, as it were. We talked about going backwards, perhaps towards our supply. What about forwards? We're really moving forwards, sort of towards the customer. In other words, the customer that is in some way using the product that is manufactured by us. So forward might be possibly towards a distribution area. So how do we distribute at the moment? Well, we outsource it. What about buying a distribution company? Linked into that, obviously, the area of transport, however that factors in, or in the area of repairs. Perhaps our widget that we produce on occasion needs to be serviced or indeed repair. How about moving into that in a related manner? Okay. Next area for us is to talk a little bit more about horizontal integration. So, in essence, what we mean by this is that we consider sort of our current capabilities. Now, think of capabilities as this in sort of competences. In other words, what we're good at. Okay, so let's use them or consider using them to develop activities or product lines that are competitive or complementary. Okay. Moving on from that, it might well be that could involve some sort of tie-in or perhaps merger in some way with a competitor, or someone perhaps producing some sort of complementary product. Okay. Now, key point here, JSW, we should be familiar with Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. When they talk about this idea of related diversification as per this model, what they suggest is that certainly, integration is possible in a number of ways, but generally speaking, related diversification is going to work better, certainly in the long term, and have more chance of success than unrelated. In other words, when we think about diversification, unrelated is really moving into an area where you have no capability, you have no expertise, you have no track record. So the suggestion here, and I guess to some extent it's common sense, is try and diversify, yes, if you can, if it makes sense, but try and diversify into an area that is in some way related to what you already do. You will have a better chance of success on that basis. Okay? Now, if we were to jump ship, as it were, and to consider unrelated diversification, or sometimes referred as conglomerate diversification, really what we're talking about is something completely different. Yeah, as it says here, beyond current capabilities. Now, I'm not suggesting that companies don't do this. They do. There are a number of examples of conglomerate diversification or unrelated. It's just difficult. And one of the things that's relevant here in terms of dealing with that difficulty is how companies tend to do it. More often than not, it's by acquisition. So rather than starting from scratch and saying, we're going to move into a totally unrelated area, we're going to diversify into X, what companies tend to do is acquire already established players in that particular area, in that particular segment. That tends to lead to the likelihood of more success rather than perhaps building from the ground up. Okay? So, next area for us is really the idea, let's consider a company that decides to diversify and indeed wants to diversify into a foreign market or indeed an international market. What sort of motives would there be for that? Why would a company taking the risk of diversify into an international market? Well, a couple of reasons. The first area is sort of general factors. It may well be that within that given market, a neighboring country, there's lower barriers. Perhaps there's lower tariffs. In other words, it's a more favorable sort of business landscape. Outside of that, it may well be that the legal framework is slightly looser. So there are, broadly speaking, a number of possible general factors that would encourage companies, if they're considering diversification, to diversify abroad. Okay. What about market factors? What sort of factors in a sort of given market would encourage a company to diversify internationally? And indeed, what are the broad sort of global issues that encourage via the market for companies to do that? Well, certainly markets are becoming more and more standardized. In other words, more and more similar to each other. Markets perhaps in Germany are not dissimilar to markets in Italy. Markets in Italy are not broadly dissimilar to perhaps markets in America. So that's the first point. The second point is globalization, the idea of the world becoming smaller, people having more and more information. And indeed, outside of that, third key point, transferable marketing. If we're marketing at home, to our audience at home, then, these days, given the sort of ability for marketers to create marketing content, very, very often what is used in terms of content or copy or indeed tactics in the home country is easily transferable to other countries. That makes it cheaper. So these are the market drivers for company pushing into foreign shores and indeed diversifying into foreign shores. What about government drivers? Are there any government drivers that would perhaps encourage or indeed discourage companies? Yeah, as we said up top in terms of the general areas, governments can certainly encourage. For example, it may well be that tariffs are low. Maybe there aren't any tariffs. Other than that, perhaps, they may discourage international expansion into their country because the legal requirements for businesses to operate and set up are very, very high. So in terms of government drivers, yeah, there may be some that encourage, but it can work in the other way. Linked into that, and I guess on the positive side, certainly free trade agreements are areas that will encourage businesses to expand internationally, to diversify internationally. World Trade Organization or perhaps the EU, and indeed this idea of free trade across EU countries. Next area for us outside of government drivers is cost drivers. Now, we've touched on this up top, but as we've said, broadly speaking, if we have the opportunity to diversify, and indeed the option is in play in terms of an international market, clearly we're looking at economies. It may well be that the home market is saturated. We've got high fixed costs. If we're able to diversify into another country, we'll be able to spread some of those fixed costs, even if they aren't related to our new diversified product in the neighboring country. We can spread our fixed costs. Outside of that, in terms of areas where, this tends to be more and more common, more often than not, certainly it is where that R&D costs are very, very high. And there is the ability by diversifying elsewhere to cover those R&D costs. Last area for us is really competitive drivers. What are the competitive areas that drive motive for international expansion? Well, we could be in a position where we believe that if we expand or diversify internationally, we can subsidize some operations. In other words, we can use higher profits elsewhere in a foreign country to shore up maybe lower profits or possibly losses elsewhere. The other option really in terms of expanding or diversifying internationally is the idea, particularly if we're a large entity, to sort of undercut local companies. And indeed, outside of that, the general suggestion in terms of competition is that certainly a similar strategy is needed abroad as at home. In other words, what we're saying is it's often better to expand when it looks like the strategy that you employ in the home country will work in the foreign country. That's generally where success takes place. Okay? Now, in terms of value networks, a couple of points here. We've talked about networks earlier on. We talked about the idea that in a given industry, there are a series of value chains, and those value chains make up, I guess, in one sense, the sort of national value network. Now, it works in the same way internationally. Certainly, we know that different countries may have different strengths. So we may well need to choose our targets or the areas that we're going to expand into based on those strengths. For example, low cost. So if we're looking to manufacture and we think we could diversify into a foreign country, it may well be we diversify into country X because of the availability of low-cost labor. Or possibly, let's say, it may well be that in that particular country there is access to a very, very sort of high-end educational system, universities, etc. And there may well be excellent R&D in that particular country. Okay? In terms of this final point, now, we've talked broadly within this particular mind map about a number of different choices. We've talked about value chains. We've also talked about expansion, Ansof's growth matrix. Now, in terms of expansion, let's just say that we're trying to expand, let's say, into a new market. What Bartlett and Goschel talk about is, there's a number of different possibilities in terms of the medium through which you expand. In other words, the type of operation that you actually set up in a foreign country. And what Bartlett and Goschel in their research say is, there's a number of different lines or different designs, as it were. The first one that they suggest is possible in their research is what's referred to generally as an organization that is simply international. And what that means really is sort of low level. We're talking about an organization that, broadly speaking, interacts in some way with overseas entities, whether or not that's a supplier, a distributor, or a customer. So we're really saying that an international organization has some form of connection, some form of interaction with overseas entities. Now, they suggest that a global organization is somewhat different. Really, a global organization, more often than not, is an organization that's probably centered around sort of divisions, or broadly speaking, independent divisions. So these are really, in a sense, autonomous sort of elements of the business that operate in different countries, broadly speaking, on a standalone basis. Next area is what Bartlett and Gushel referred to as, multinational organizations. So really what we're talking about there is, a business that doesn't quite have a home country or a home domicile. They're really a business that is, in essence, focusing on local operations. It's really set up in such a way that it really acts as local companies, local competitors do. Next area here is transnational. Now, transnational is a sort of a combination of all three above in one sense, because what they do is not so much operate as divisions in the same way as global. Really, a transnational broadly means that some aspects of the business are looked at and operated on a global basis. Some aspects of the business, some elements of service, but some are broached on the basis of local. In other words, some are sort of broadly independent, acting as if they're like a competitor in that foreign country. Okay, so Gushel and indeed Bartlett suggest 4 possibilities, and I guess it's up to the company to decide what the best move forward is. Okay, next area, selection or market selection. Now, outside of, I guess, the medium, are we going to operate on a transnational basis, or are we going to operate on a sort of a divisional basis? How do we sort of select markets? What considerations over and above what we've already said? Well, several things to consider for the business. Obviously, which major markets are different. Markets operate in a different way, despite the points that we've made about globalization. We need to choose carefully. Next key point is in terms of the products. Should we standardize products? We'll note that, when we look at businesses that operate internationally, sometimes the products are not standardized. In other words, sometimes the same product is changed slightly in a given other country. Linked into that, in terms of operating internationally and choosing markets, as mentioned, markets are different and consumers can be different, notwithstanding the world getting smaller and globalization, etc. We need to consider what are the components that are going to make up our marketing attack or our marketing approach. And final point here, it may well be that we need to integrate our moves. In other words, if we're marketing in some way in a home country, we may well need to take what we're doing in that home country into account if we're marketing in a neighboring country with, let's say, the same standardized product. So in terms of market selection, quite a number of things for a business to consider. Okay, now, in terms of entry, or indeed modes of entry, so let's say that we've considered, how we're going to operate. We've also considered that one particular market is suitable for us. What about modes of entry into markets? Well, again, this links into trading medium, etc. Clearly we could, export, or we could simply export from home country to foreign country. We could consider setting up some sort of production facility and indeed making our widgets or making our products in the foreign country. We could consider a subsidiary, in other words, a standalone vehicle, an incorporated entity to produce our widgets in the home country. We could consider contracting the manufacturer out to a foreign entity in a foreign country. Or possibly, last one here, we could consider the areas of franchising, licensing, or maybe a JV of some kind. So in terms of modes of entry, again, a number of possibilities, several possibilities, and I guess, companies, individual companies looking to expand, looking to move into new markets are going to have to weigh up the options and indeed do their research carefully. Next area for us is our closure. So let's sum up. We've talked about choices. We've talked about a series of choices that face businesses, not least in terms of, achieving competitive advantage, not least in terms of, expansion. We've talked carefully about the idea of operating abroad, the means of entry, the vehicles, the risks, the advantages. We talked about diversification in so many different respects, related, unrelated, and we've linked that into integration, perhaps backwards towards the supplier, perhaps sideways, horizontal, or maybe forwards towards the distribution or indeed the consumer. So in terms of linking this back into SBL, I think the key things in each of the models or each of the areas concerning strategy is to make sure you have a reasonable fix on the models. So for example, in this section, a good area to focus in on in this video is certainly Ansof's matrix and understanding the terms. So understanding, what does penetration mean? What does diversification mean? What does product development mean? And broadly speaking, what are the concerns that a business would have in moving in those areas, e.g. risk, e.g. advantages, e.g. disadvantages, etc. Okay, so I hope you found that helpful. Please do join me for Chapter 13 in due course. Many thanks.